In the darkness, something drains the life from the livestock. Welcome to local legends. Today, the Chupacabra, the beam of a flashlight cuts through the humid Puerto Rican night, sweeping across a field where mangoes lie rotting in the grass. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth and something else. Something metallic, like copper pennies left in the rain. In the distance, a rooster that should be crowing at dawn remains silent. The silence itself feels wrong, as though the island is holding its breath. The flashlight beam finds the fence line first, then follows it to where the goats should be sleeping in their pen. But they are not sleeping. They will never sleep again. Their bodies lie in positions that suggest they tried to run, tried to escape, but something caught them, something fast. And when the beam finally settles on the first carcass, what it reveals defies the natural order of predation. No torn flesh, no scattered entrails, just puncture wounds, perfectly circular, and bodies drained so completely, they seem like leather husks, collapsed inward, as though something had drunk them dry. This is not the work of dogs. This is not the work of anything the farmer has seen in 40 years of raising livestock on this land. This is the work of the Chupacabra. The island of Puerto Rico lies in the Caribbean Sea, a mountainous terrain of limestone karst and tropical rainforest, where Spanish colonial architecture crumbles slowly into jungle green. For centuries, the people of this island have lived between worlds, indigenous Tafeno roots buried beneath layers of Spanish conquest, African slavery, and American occupation. By the mid-1990s, Puerto Rico existed in a peculiar state of political limbo, neither fully independent nor fully integrated into the United States. A commonwealth whose people carried American passports but could not vote in American elections. The towns scattered across the island's interior, places like Canfeyvanas, Orocovis, and Caguas, retained a rural character, even as San Juan sprawled along the coast. Farmers still raised chickens, goats, and cattle on small plots of land, continuing practices their grandparents had followed. They knew the rhythms of the tropical storms, the patterns of the coq-fay frogs that sang each evening, the habits of every predator that might threaten their animals. They knew the mongoose that had been imported to kill rats. They knew the feral dogs that sometimes formed packs. They knew the vultures that circled overhead when death came naturally. But in 1995, death came in a form they did not know. The first reports emerged from Canfeyvanas, a municipality in the northeastern part of the island. In March of that year, Madeleine Tolentino, a resident of the town, would later provide the description that would define the creature in the public imagination. But she was not the first to lose animals. Farmers across the region began finding their livestock dead under circumstances that violated everything they understood about predation. The animals, primarily goats, but also chickens, rabbits, and occasionally larger livestock, were not eaten. They were punctured, usually with 2 or 3 small holes in the neck or chest area, and exsanguinated so thoroughly that they seemed deflated. No blood pooled around the bodies. No blood trail led away from the scene, as though it had been extracted with surgical precision. Some carcasses were discovered still warm. Traditional predators leave evidence of their feeding: tooth marks, claw marks, scattered remains. This left nothing but the empty shell of what had once been alive. The name came quickly, coined by Puerto Rican comedian and television personality Silverio P. Ferres. Chupacabra, goat sucker. The word itself is a compound of the Spanish chupa, meaning to suck, and cabra, meaning goat. It was a name that focused on the method rather than the creature itself, defining the entity by what it did rather than what it was. And what it did was drain blood. The attack spread throughout 1995, moving from town to town across Puerto Rico, with a pattern that suggested either multiple creatures or a single entity with an extensive range. By August, more than 150 animals had been found dead across 8 municipalities. The panic was not limited to the loss of livestock, though that was serious enough for families who depended on those animals for their livelihood. The panic came from the inexplicability of it. In a world where most mysteries can be explained by science, where predation follows predictable patterns, the Chupacabra violated the rules. It was unknown, and what is unknown quickly becomes more than itself. Madeleine Tolentino's sighting in August 1995 gave form to the formless dread. She described a creature approximately 3 to 4 feet tall, standing upright on powerful hind legs. Its skin was grayish, green, leathery, or reptilian in texture. Its head was oval, shaped with enormous eyes that wrapped partially around the sides of the skull, giving it an almost alien appearance. The eyes were red or black, depending on the account, and seemed to lack the reflective quality of mammalian eyes. Down the creature's back ran a row of spines or quills, beginning at the base of the skull and continuing down to a thin whip-like tail. The arms were thin but ended in 3-fingered claws. The creature's mouth, she said, contained fangs. Some versions specify 2 prominent fangs. Others describe rows of sharp teeth. When she saw it through her window, it was moving in a strange hopping motion, using its powerful legs to propel itself forward in great bounds that covered distance with unnatural speed. The image she described, and later sketched for investigators, became the canonical Chupacabra, reproduced in newspaper illustrations, television reports, and eventually countless artistic interpretations. It was a creature that seemed to belong to science fiction rather than to the natural world. But Tolentino's description, however influential, was not the only version. Other witnesses across Puerto Rico described variations. Some reported a creature that was more canine in appearance, with a pronounced snout, canine teeth, and a hunched dog-like posture. Some said it had wings, leathery membranes stretching between elongated fingers like those of a bat. Others insisted it had no wings but could leap great distances or even levitate. Some witnesses described a sulfurous smell accompanying the creature, while others reported no odor at all. A few accounts mentioned the creature's ability to change color, chameleon-like, or to become partially transparent, making it difficult to see clearly. The variance in descriptions might suggest different creatures, misidentification of known animals, or the malleability of memory under stress. But the one constant across nearly all reports was the method. Animals drained of blood through small puncture wounds, usually in the neck. The how of it remained unexplained. No known predator feeds exclusively on blood without consuming tissue. Even vampire bats, which do feed on blood, lap it from surface wounds rather than draining their prey dry. This was something different. The reports from Puerto Rico did not remain isolated to the island. By 1996, sightings and livestock deaths attributed to the Chupacabra began appearing across Latin America. Mexico reported incidents in multiple states, from the northern borderlands to the southern provinces. In Sinaloa, farmers found cattle dead with the familiar puncture wounds. In Jalisco, chickens were discovered drained in their coops. The pattern spread to Central America, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua. In some regions, the creature was described in terms similar to the Puerto Rican accounts. In others, local folklore adapted the Chupacabra to fit existing belief systems, merging it with older legends of blood, drinking entities. Brazil reported its own wave of sightings in 1997. Brazilian accounts often described a creature with more bat-like characteristics. Chile, Argentina, and Peru followed. The Chupacabra had become a continental phenomenon, spreading through Spanish-speaking communities with a speed that suggested either a remarkable migratory creature or the viral transmission of an idea. The creature's arrival in the United States was perhaps inevitable given Puerto Rico's political relationship with the mainland and the extensive Puerto Rican diaspora communities in Florida, New York, and other states. But the American Chupacabra took on characteristics distinct from its Caribbean origin. The first significant wave of American sightings occurred in Texas in 2004. Though there had been scattered reports earlier. In the Texas accounts, the creature was almost uniformly described as canine rather than reptilian, a hairless, grayish-blue animal with a pronounced spinal ridge, mange-ravaged skin, and a gaunt, almost skeletal appearance. The animals matched none of the witnesses' expectations of known species. They were not coyotes, though they were approximately coyote-sized. They were not dogs, though they had a dog-like skeletal structure. They moved with a strange gait, sometimes on all fours, Sometimes ranchers in South Texas began finding these creatures dead along roadsides or managing to shoot them when they approached livestock. The bodies were preserved, photographed, and in some cases subjected to analysis. Every scientific examination reached the same conclusion. These were canids, likely coyotes or dogs, suffering from severe mange and possibly other health conditions that explained their unusual appearance. But the explanation never fully satisfied those who had seen the creatures alive, moving through the darkness with eyes that reflected flashlight beams in colors that seemed unnatural. The Texas Chupacabra became its own entity, distinct from the Puerto Rican version. While the original Chupacabra stood upright and bore a reptilian or alien appearance, the Texas variant was quadrupedal and mammalian, albeit grotesquely altered by disease. This divergence suggests two possibilities. Either the Chupacabra is not a single species, but a name applied to multiple unexplained phenomena, or the creature itself is capable of extreme variation, perhaps even shape-shifting between forms. Cryptozoologists, those who study animals not recognized by mainstream science, have proposed various theories. Some argue that the original Puerto Rican Chupacabra may have been a previously unknown reptilian species, possibly disturbed by deforestation or military activity on the island. Others suggest an escaped exotic pet, perhaps a private collector's illegal primate or reptile that adapted to its new environment. A few theorists have proposed more extraordinary explanations. A genetic experiment escaped from a government laboratory, an extraterrestrial life form, or even a creature from another dimension that manifests temporarily in our reality. The scientific community largely dismisses these speculations, attributing the phenomenon to mass hysteria, misidentification of known animals, and the human tendency to see patterns and agency in random events. To understand the Chupacabra's place in the broader context of North American cryptozoology and folklore, we must recognize that Puerto Rico, despite its Caribbean location, exists within the sphere of North American culture through its political relationship with the United States. The Chupacabra represents something relatively rare in North American cryptozoology, a modern legend with a specific point of origin. Most legendary creatures of North America, Bigfoot, the Wendigo, the Skinwalker, have roots that extend back centuries or millennia into indigenous traditions. The Chupacabra, by contrast, emerged in the 1990s, making it a contemporary phenomenon that can be studied with modern tools and documented in real time. This temporal proximity makes it both more accessible to investigation and more resistant to mythologization. We can interview witnesses who are still alive. We can examine photographs and video footage. We can apply forensic analysis to the physical evidence. Yet despite all these advantages, the Chupacabra remains elusive. Its nature still debated, its reality still contested. The creature's name and nature resonate with older traditions, even as they emerge from contemporary circumstances. From the Lamia of ancient Greek mythology to the Strigoi of Romanian folklore, from the Aztec Cihuateo to the Baovan Sith of Scottish legend, humanity has long imagined creatures that sustain themselves on blood. Vampirism as a folkloric concept predates Bram Stoker's Dracula by millennia, appearing in diverse forms across different cultures that had no contact with one another. The ubiquity of these legends suggests something fundamental in human psychology. Some deep anxiety about the vulnerability of the body, the importance of blood, and the fear of predation. The Chupacabra fits within this ancient lineage, while simultaneously representing something distinctly modern. Unlike the European vampire, which is usually a reanimated human corpse, the Chupacabra is described as an animal or alien creature, fitting more comfortably into a post-Darwinian worldview that seeks biological explanations for phenomena. It is vampirism without the supernatural trappings, blood drinking as an ecological niche rather than a curse. Puerto Rico's cultural landscape provides essential context for understanding how the Chupacabra legend took root and spread. The island has a complex relationship with the supernatural, blending indigenous Tafeno beliefs, Catholic traditions brought by Spanish colonizers, African spiritual practices introduced through slavery, and more recent influences from American culture and media. Spiritualism, folk Catholicism, and various forms of syncretic belief remain common in rural areas. Many Puerto Ricans maintain a pragmatic acceptance of the supernatural, not necessarily believing in every reported phenomenon, but remaining open to possibilities that fall outside strict scientific materialism. This cultural openness creates fertile ground for new legends to emerge and be taken seriously. At least provisionally, the Chupacabra did not arise in a vacuum of skepticism, but in a cultural context where the extraordinary, while not commonplace, is considered possible. The island's economic situation in the 1990s also matters. Puerto Rico had experienced significant industrial development in the preceding decades, with pharmaceutical companies and other manufacturers establishing facilities to take advantage of tax incentives. But this industrialization had created environmental concerns, with some areas experiencing contamination from industrial waste. There were also persistent rumors about secret government facilities and military testing, fueled by the genuine presence of U.S. military installations on the island, and the long history of the U.S. Navy's controversial use of Vieques as a bombing range. When something inexplicable occurred, when farmers found their animals dead in ways that defied natural explanation, these background anxieties provided a framework for interpretation. Perhaps the Chupacabra was the result of industrial pollution, a mutant created by chemical contamination. Perhaps it was a military experiment gone wrong, an engineered bioweapon that had escaped its containment. These theories reflected very real concerns about power, autonomy, and the effects of colonialism and industrialization on Puerto Rican life. The physical description provided by Tolentino and others draws, perhaps unconsciously, from familiar cultural sources. The large-eyed, grayish-skinned, thin-limbed creature bears a striking resemblance to the popular image of extraterrestrial aliens, particularly the gray alien type that had become ubiquitous in science fiction and UFO related media by the 1990s. Tolentino herself later acknowledged that she had recently watched the science fiction film Species, which featured a creature with some similar characteristics. This admission has led skeptics to suggest that her sighting was heavily influenced by this cinematic exposure, that she saw something, perhaps a mundane animal or even a shadow, and her brain, primed by the recent film, filled in details that matched the fictional creature. This explanation is plausible and highlights the complex relationship between perception, memory, and cultural influence. We do not see the world directly. We see it filtered through our expectations, our fears, and the images that populate our cultural landscape. The Chupacabra may be, in part, a creature of cinema and television as much as of flesh and blood, but this cultural influence does not fully account for the phenomenon. Even if Tolentino's description was shaped by media exposure, it does not explain the livestock deaths themselves. Animals were dying. Their bodies were being found drained of blood. These were material facts, documented and undeniable. The question is not whether something was killing livestock in Puerto Rico in 1995, but what that something was and whether it matched the descriptions provided by witnesses. Veterinarians and agricultural officials who examined the carcasses often found more mundane explanations. Decomposition can cause bloating and changes in tissue that might be mistaken for blood drainage. Insects, particularly ants, can consume bodily fluids and soft tissues in ways that leave carcasses appearing mysteriously emptied. Ordinary predators like feral dogs or mongoose can sometimes kill without consuming their prey, particularly if they are young, inexperienced, or simply kill in excess when presented with penned animals that cannot escape. The puncture wounds attributed to the Chupacabra might be bite marks from known predators, or they might be artifacts of decomposition, or they might be normal injuries that the animal sustained before death from other causes. Yet, these explanations, while scientifically sound, often fail to convince those who have experienced the phenomenon firsthand. A farmer who has raised goats for decades knows what a dog attack looks like. A veterinarian familiar with decomposition can distinguish between normal post-mortem changes and something unusual. The gap between official explanations and local experience creates space for the legend to persist. When authorities tell someone that what they saw with their own eyes did not happen, or that it has a prosaic explanation that contradicts their direct experience, the natural response is skepticism toward authority rather than toward one's own senses. The Chupacabra thrives in this gap between expert knowledge and lived experience. The Chupacabaristics that are worth examining. The incidents occurred primarily at night, with animals discovered dead in the early morning. This is consistent with nocturnal predators, but it is also consistent with the behavior of any predator that wishes to avoid human contact. The attacks often occurred in waves, with multiple incidents in a particular area over several nights, followed by a period of quiescence, then a new wave of attacks in a different location. This pattern could suggest a territorial animal establishing range, or it could indicate a transient creature moving across the landscape. Some researchers noted that the pattern of attacks followed a rough geographical progression, moving from the northeastern part of the island toward the central and southern regions over the course of several months. Whether this represented the movement of a single entity, the spread of multiple creatures, or simply the spread of attention and reporting is difficult to determine. By late 1995, the media coverage had become so intense that any unusual livestock death in Puerto Rico was likely to be attributed to the Chupacabra, regardless of its actual cause. The creature had become a catch. All explanation, a label applied to diverse phenomena. The Puerto Rican government's response to the Chupacabra panic was cautious and somewhat dismissive. Official statements emphasized natural explanations and urged the public not to panic. The island's Department of Agriculture investigated the deaths, but did not issue any definitive conclusion about an unknown predator. Some local mayors took the matter more seriously, organizing search parties and encouraging armed residents to patrol their properties at night. These responses reflected the democratic structure of Puerto Rican municipalities, where local officials needed to respond to their constituents' concerns, regardless of what experts in San Juan might say. In at least one case, a mayor held a press conference displaying a supposed Chupacabra corpse, which subsequent examination revealed to be a mongoose, or possibly a small dog. The corpse's skin had been partially removed, whether by decomposition or deliberate action, making identification more difficult and allowing the ambiguity to persist. The episode illustrated how the Chupacabra had become politically useful, a way for local officials to demonstrate responsiveness to their community's fears. The Catholic Church's position on the Chupacabra was mixed and localized. Some priests dismissed it as superstition, while others took a more open stance, acknowledging that evil can manifest in many forms and that the natural world contains mysteries not yet fully understood by science. A few priests conducted blessings of farms and livestock at the request of worried parishioners, treating the Chupacabra as a spiritual matter requiring spiritual remedies. This pragmatic approach reflected Catholicism's historical flexibility in accommodating local beliefs, a characteristic that had allowed the Church to adapt to indigenous and African traditions throughout Latin America. The Chupacabra was not officially recognized as a demonic entity, but neither was it entirely dismissed. It existed in the ambiguous space that the Church traditionally reserves for phenomena that are neither clearly miraculous nor clearly fraudulent, objects of caution rather than doctrine. Among Puerto Rico's evangelical and Pentecostal communities, which had grown significantly in the decades preceding the Chupacabra phenomenon, interpretations tended toward the demonic. Some pastors described the creature as a manifestation of Satan or a demon sent to terrorize God's creation. Prayer vigils were held to protect communities from spiritual attack. This interpretation fit within a worldview that sees spiritual warfare as an ongoing reality, with demons constantly seeking to disrupt human life and sow fear. The Chupacabra, in this framework, was less an animal than a spiritual agent, its physical manifestation secondary to its role in a cosmic struggle between good and evil. This theological interpretation gave the phenomenon significance beyond its immediate material effects, transforming dead goats into signs of deeper spiritual conflict. The spread of the Chupacabra legend beyond Puerto Rico followed the pathways of media and migration. Television reports, initially local but soon picked up by international Spanish language networks like Univision and Telemundo, carried the story throughout Latin America and to Latino communities in the United States. The visual language of these reports, dramatic music, shadowy reenactments, interviews with frightened witnesses, created a narrative framework that emphasized mystery and fear. The story was compelling television, offering both exotic locale and genuine fear, scientific puzzle and cultural specificity. It was the kind of story that travels well across borders, requiring little cultural translation to be understood and appreciated. A farmer in Mexico could immediately relate to a farmer in Puerto Rico losing livestock to an unknown predator. The economic and emotional stakes were universal, even if the creature itself was foreign. Print journalism approached the Chupacabra with more skepticism than television, though tabloids embraced it enthusiastically. The Weekly World News, a satirical American tabloid that presented obvious fiction as factual news, ran multiple stories about the Chupacabra throughout the late 1990s, often embellishing the legend with invented details that nevertheless entered popular consciousness. Mainstream newspapers covered the phenomenon with a tone of amused distance, treating it as a curiosity rather than a serious mystery. The New York Times published an article in 1996 that framed the Chupacabra as a cultural phenomenon rather than a cryptozoological one, examining what the legend revealed about Puerto Rican society and the power of rumor in the age of mass media. This framing, Chupacabra, a sociological object rather than biological entity, became the standard approach for mainstream English language journalism. The creature was interesting, not because it might be real, but because people believed it was real. The first reported Chupacabra incidents in the United States occurred in Florida, particularly in areas with large Puerto Rican populations. In 1996 and 1997, the descriptions in these early mainland sightings generally matched the Puerto Rican template: bipedal, reptilian or alien, like creatures seen at night, accompanied by unexplained livestock deaths. These reports received some local media attention, but did not generate the same level of sustained interest that the phenomenon had produced in Puerto Rico. Perhaps this was because the United States, with its vast territory and diverse wildlife, already had its own catalogue of legendary creatures: Bigfoot, the Mothman, various lake monsters, and the Chupacabra was simply another entry in an already crowded field. Or perhaps the cultural context was different. The communities experiencing the sightings were smaller and less able to drive a sustained media narrative. The Florida Chupacabra remained a minor curiosity, reported but not deeply investigated. Texas changed the American Chupacabra narrative, beginning around 2004 and continuing intermittently through the following decade. Ranchers in South Texas began reporting a strange canine-like creature killing chickens and small livestock. Unlike the Puerto Rican reports, these did not describe a bipedal reptilian entity. Instead, witnesses described something that looked like a dog or coyote, but profoundly wrong: hairless, with grayish, blue skin, a pronounced ridge along the spine, and eyes that seemed too large for the skull. The creatures moved strangely, sometimes with a hopping gait, sometimes with a crouched, slinking motion that seemed furtive and alien. Despite the familiar canine body plan, unlike the elusive Puerto Rican Chupacabra, which was rarely photographed and never captured, the Texas version left bodies. Dead specimens were found along roadsides, shot by ranchers, or hit by cars. These corpses could be examined, photographed, and subjected to scientific analysis. The first well-documented Texas Chupacabra corpse was found in Elmendorf, a small community south of San Antonio, in 2004. Phyllis Canyon, a rancher who had been losing chickens to nighttime predators, managed to obtain the body of the creature she believed was responsible. The animal was approximately 30 inches long, with grayish-blue skin. Virtually no hair except for a sparse strip along the back. A pronounced overbite with long canine teeth, and unusual front legs that seemed longer than typical canids. Canyon had the animal's head preserved by a taxidermist and sent tissue samples for DNA analysis. The results were unambiguous. The creature was a coyote, Canis latrans. The unusual appearance was attributed to sarcoptic mange, a parasitic skin disease caused by mites that burrow into the skin, causing hair loss, thickening of the skin, and significant suffering. Severe cases of mange can alter an animal's appearance dramatically, making even familiar species difficult to recognize. The Chupacabra was a sick coyote, nothing more. But this explanation, while scientifically sound, raises its own questions. Why had mange afflicted coyotes not been widely reported before? Why did the condition seem so consistently to produce animals that witnesses described as fundamentally alien? Why were these creatures so often described as having an unusual gait or posture? Veterinarians point out that mange is extremely uncomfortable, causing intense itching and pain that would certainly affect an animal's movement. A coyote suffering from advanced mange would move differently than a healthy one, perhaps adopting postures that relieve the discomfort of the affected skin. The disease also causes significant weight loss, giving the animal a gaunt skeletal appearance that, combined with the hairlessness, creates a silhouette unlike any healthy wild canid. The blue-gray coloration of the skin might be a combination of the diseased skin's natural color and possible secondary bacterial infections. The large, prominent eyes might simply be more noticeable in the absence of fur around the orbital region. Every feature attributed to the Texas Chupacabra can be explained as a symptom of disease in a known animal. Yet the persistence of the sightings and the consistency of descriptions across multiple independent witnesses suggests something more than simple misidentification. It is possible that environmental changes in South Texas created conditions favorable for mange outbreaks in coyote populations. Drought conditions, which have become more frequent and severe in recent decades, can stress wildlife populations and compromise their immune systems, making them more susceptible to parasitic infections. Changes in prey availability might force coyotes to venture closer to human habitation in search of food, increasing the likelihood of encounters. The use of rodenticides in agricultural areas might create secondary poisoning effects in predators that consume poisoned rodents, further stressing their health and potentially exacerbating skin conditions. If these factors combined to produce an increase in mange, affected coyotes in areas where ranching communities were likely to encounter them, the stage would be set for the Chupacabra to manifest not as a new species, but as a new recognition of a familiar species altered by disease and environmental pressure. The narrative had shifted in Puerto Rico. The Chupacabra was a mystery, an unknown entity that might represent anything from an undiscovered species to an alien visitor. In Texas, the Chupacabra became pathological, a known animal distorted by disease into a form that triggered instinctive revulsion and fear. This transformation of the legend reflects a broader pattern in how contemporary American culture processes mystery, where Puerto Rican culture, with its greater acceptance of the supernatural and the unexplained, could accommodate a genuinely anomalous creature. American culture, deeply shaped by scientific materialism, required the mystery to be solved, the unknown to be explained, the Chupacabra to be identified as something already catalogued and understood. The creature could exist in American discourse only after it had been domesticated, rendered explicable, reduced to a sick coyote rather than remaining a genuine enigma. The divergence between the Puerto Rican and Texan Chupacabras is stark enough that some researchers argue they should be considered entirely separate phenomena that happen to share a name. The bipedal reptilian creature of Puerto Rico and the hairless canid of Texas have little in common beyond their association with livestock deaths and the name attached to them. Perhaps the Texas ranchers, hearing about the Chupacabra through media coverage of the Puerto Rican phenomenon, simply applied that exotic, evocative name to the strange-looking predators they encountered. The name traveled, but the creature it named transformed in transit, adapting to new circumstances and new witnesses. This linguistic drift is common in folklore. Names migrate across cultures, attaching to different entities, creating false connections between unrelated traditions. The Chupacabra may be a name that now encompasses multiple phenomena, a label applied opportunistically to anything that combines strangeness with blood. The scientific investigation of the Chupacabra phenomenon has proceeded along several lines. Cryptozoologists, who occupy an ambiguous position between mainstream science and amateur investigation, have conducted fieldwork in areas with high concentrations of sightings, attempting to document evidence through photographs, video, and physical traces. These investigations have produced numerous photographs of unusual animals, most of which have been identified as known species, often afflicted with disease or injury. Hair samples collected from sites of alleged Chupacabra activity have been analyzed and invariably identified as coming from known species: coyotes, dogs, raccoons. The cryptozoological community itself is divided on the Chupacabra, with some researchers convinced that there is a genuine unknown animal behind at least some of the reports. while others consider the phenomenon entirely explained by misidentification and folklore. Mainstream zoologists have largely dismissed the Chupacabra as a cryptozoological entity. The consensus view is that all reports can be explained through some combination of misidentification of known animals, particularly those afflicted with disease, folkloric belief, and cultural transmission of legend, media amplification of mundane events, and the psychological tendency to see agency and intention in random patterns. From this perspective, there is no Chupacabra to investigate, because there is no actual unknown animal. The phenomenon exists entirely in the realm of culture, psychology, and misperception. This dismissal is not unreasonable given the lack of physical evidence for any creature matching the original Puerto Rican descriptions, and the clear identification of the Texas chupacabras as diseased coyotes. Science requires repeatable, verifiable evidence, and the chupacabra has not provided it. Anthropologists and folklorists have shown more interest in the chupacabra precisely because they are not concerned with whether the creature is biologically real. Their interest lies in what the legend reveals about the communities that generate and sustain it. The chupacabra can be read as a text, a narrative that encodes anxieties, power relations, and cultural tensions. In Puerto Rico, the creature emerged at a moment of economic uncertainty and continued political ambiguity about the island's status. The chupacabra could be interpreted as an embodiment of fears about exploitation, a predator that takes without giving, that drains resources and leaves nothing behind. Much as Puerto Ricans might feel about their relationship with the United States or with global capitalism, the creature's alien appearance might reflect feelings of alienation, the sense that forces beyond understanding or control are shaping Puerto Rican life. That these forces are literally sucking the life from the land is almost too perfect a metaphor to be accidental, though of course no one consciously designed the legend to encode these meanings. Folklore emerges organically from collective experience, distilling shared anxieties into narrative form. In the American Southwest, the chupacabra takes on different resonances. The region has a long history of conflict over resources, particularly water and grazing land. Ranching communities exist in a precarious relationship with the desert environment, constantly aware of how thin the margin is between survival and ruin. The presence of predators, coyotes, mountain lions, even wild dogs, is a constant concern for anyone raising livestock. The chupacabra in this context might represent an intensification of that ever-present threat. Predation made strange and thus more frightening. The fact that the Texas chupacabra is ultimately revealed to be a diseased coyote, rather than an unknown creature, might itself be significant. Disease, environmental degradation, ecosystem disruption. These are the real threats facing the American Southwest, perhaps more insidious than any predator, because they operate at a systemic level, altering the fundamental conditions of life. A sick coyote is a symptom of a sick ecosystem. The chupacabra in this reading is not a monster but a warning sign. The chupacabra has also been analyzed through the lens of post-colonial theory. Puerto Rico's status as a U.S. territory, colonized first by Spain, then by the United States, never fully independent, creates a complex cultural position. Puerto Ricans are American citizens, but not full participants in American democracy. The island receives federal funding but has no voting representation in Congress. This liminal status, neither fully colonized nor fully free, creates its own anxieties about identity and agency. The chupacabra, emerging from this context, can be read as a reassertion of Puerto Rican cultural uniqueness. Here is something that belongs to Puerto Rico, that emerged from Puerto Rican experience, that cannot be fully understood or controlled by outside authorities, even if those authorities explain it away as misidentification or folklore. Even if scientists dismiss it, the legend persists within Puerto Rican culture because it serves a function there. It is a story Puerto Ricans tell about themselves, a narrative of mystery and danger that centers Puerto Rican experience, rather than treating the island as peripheral to some mainland story. The legends spread to other Latin American countries follows similar patterns. In each location, the chupacabra adapts to local conditions, while maintaining certain core features. It remains associated with livestock deaths and blood drainage. It remains elusive, rarely photographed, never captured alive. It remains officially unexplained even when official explanations are offered. This adaptability is characteristic of successful folklore, like the vampire in European tradition, which took different forms in different regions. The strigoi of Romania, the upper of Russia, the vrikalakas of Greece. The chupacabra has become a template that can be filled with local content. The creature is whatever it needs to be to embody a community's fears about predation, exploitation, and forces beyond control. The role of media in creating and sustaining the Chupacabra legend cannot be overstated. Television coverage in the mid-1990s, particularly on Spanish language networks, gave the phenomenon visibility far beyond what word-of-mouth transmission could have achieved. The visual grammar of these reports established expectations about what a Chupacabra story should look like and sound like. Dramatic music, shadowy night, vision footage, emotional interviews with frightened witnesses, statements from skeptical authorities. This became the standard format, replicated across hundreds of news segments. Each new report reinforced the reality of the phenomenon by treating it as newsworthy, even when the ostensible purpose of the report was to debunk or explain it, simply by covering the story. News media validated it as a legitimate topic of concern. The Chupacabra was real enough to report on. Therefore, it was real. The internet amplified this effect exponentially. As internet access expanded throughout Latin America and the United States in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the Chupacabra found a new medium perfectly suited to its needs. Online forums, early blogs, and websites dedicated to the paranormal and unexplained gave the legend space to grow unconstrained by editorial standards or fact. Checking photographs of ambiguous animals could be shared globally within hours. Eyewitness accounts could be posted directly without journalistic mediation. Theories about the creature's origin, nature, and significance could be developed collaboratively by communities of believers unchallenged by skeptical voices. The internet enabled confirmation bias on a massive scale, allowing people to find communities that reinforced rather than challenged their beliefs about the Chupacabra. It also allowed the legend to become truly transnational, no longer bound to specific geographic regions but accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The Chupacabra became global, even as it remained rooted in specific local experiences. Social media further accelerated the legend's spread. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube provided platforms for instant sharing of Chupacabra related content. A grainy video of a strange animal in someone's backyard in Texas could be viewed by millions within days. The comment sections beneath these posts became spaces for collective interpretation, with users from diverse backgrounds offering explanations, sharing their own experiences, or simply expressing fear and fascination. The algorithm-driven nature of social media meant that people interested in the Chupacabra would be shown more Chupacabra content, creating feedback loops that could make the phenomenon seem ubiquitous. The line between genuine reports and deliberate hoaxes became increasingly difficult to discern. Motivations for posting Chupacabra content ranged from sincere belief to ironic humor, to deliberate deception for financial gain. Some videos purporting to show the Chupacabra were obvious hoaxes, computer-generated, or showing known animals. Others were ambiguous enough to sustain genuine uncertainty. The medium itself made verification difficult. A low-resolution video of a strange creature at night is almost designed to be ambiguous, to show just enough to trigger recognition without revealing enough to permit identification. The commercialization of the Chupacabra began almost immediately after the legend emerged into public consciousness. T-shirts bearing stylized images of the creature appeared in markets across Puerto Rico within months of the first sightings. Toy companies produced Chupacabra action figures. Restaurants and bars adopted the name, trading on its exotic danger. Comic books featured the creature, initially in Spanish language publications, but soon in English language series as well. The Chupacabra became a brand, a marker of Latin American popular culture that could be deployed for commercial purposes. This commodification might seem to undermine the legend's authenticity, transforming a genuine expression of folk belief into a mere marketing tool. But commercialization and genuine belief are not mutually exclusive. The same person who buys a Chupacabra t-shirt as a humorous souvenir might also take seriously a neighbor's report of strange sounds in the night and missing chickens. The creature can occupy multiple registers simultaneously: joke, commodity, legend, and genuine fear. Without contradiction in literature, the Chupacabra has inspired both popular fiction and more literary treatments. Young adult novels have featured the creature as an antagonist or misunderstood entity, introducing it to generations who might not otherwise encounter the legend. Rodolfo Anaya, one of the most prominent Chicano authors, incorporated the Chupacabra into his 1996 novel Chupacabra and the Roswell UFO, linking it to other American legends and conspiracy theories in a work that blends humor, cultural commentary, and genuine engagement with folklore. Michael Crichton's Prey, while not directly about the Chupacabra, was partially inspired by the phenomenon and explores similar themes of predation by an entity that defies easy categorization. These literary treatments tend to approach the Chupacabra as metaphor rather than as a biological entity, using it to explore themes of cultural identity, environmental destruction, scientific hubris, or xenophobia. The creature's ambiguous nature, neither fully animal nor fully something else, makes it useful as a literary device, a way of talking about liminal states and ambiguous identities. In film, the Chupacabra has appeared primarily in low-budget horror movies that treat it as a straightforward monster. Films like Chupacabra, Dark Seas 2005 and Chupacabra Terror 2005 transplant the creature into B-movie plots, with little attention to the legend's cultural origins or significance. These films are part of a larger genre of creature features that emerge from the direct-to-video market, designed for quick consumption rather than lasting impact. More interesting are documentary treatments, which have approached the phenomenon from various angles. The Sci-Fi Channel's Destination Truth included Chupacabra investigations in several episodes, treating it with the semi-serious tone characteristic of paranormal reality television, acknowledging skepticism while maintaining enough ambiguity to sustain viewer interest. History Channel's Monster Quest dedicated an episode to the creature, conducting genetic analysis of alleged Chupacabra carcasses and interviewing witnesses. These documentaries walk a careful line, presenting both believer and skeptic perspectives, without definitively endorsing either, allowing viewers to maintain whatever interpretation they prefer. The Chupacabra's presence in video games is less extensive but notable. The Castlevania series, which draws on global monster mythology, included a Chupacabra in Castlevania, Order of Ecclesia 2008, though its depiction bore little resemblance to the folklore version. The Mexican-themed adventure game, Grim Fandango, includes references to the creature as part of its Day of the Dead inspired aesthetic. Red Dead Redemption Undead Nightmare 2010 features a Chupacabra as one of the mythical creatures players can hunt, depicting it as a canine entity in keeping with the Texas interpretation. These appearances in games reinforce the creature's status as a recognized element of modern monster mythology. Familiar enough to need no introduction, flexible enough to be adapted to various gameplay contexts. The interactive nature of games creates a different relationship with the legend than passive media consumption. When a player hunts a Chupacabra in a video game, they are engaging with the legend actively, testing themselves against the creature in a simulated form. This creates a kind of experiential knowledge, however fictional, that might make the legend feel more real or at least more resonant. Music has also drawn on the Chupacabra, particularly in Latin American rock, metal, and punk scenes. Bands have adopted the name, written songs about the creature, or used its image in album art. The Mexican rock band Molotov referenced the Chupacabra in their satirical social commentary. The creature appears in corridos, the traditional Mexican ballad form that often narrates current events and local legends. These musical references tend to treat the Chupacabra with a mix of seriousness and irony, acknowledging its place in popular culture while maintaining connection to its folkloric roots. Music, perhaps more than any other medium, allows the legend to remain vital within the communities where it originated, keeping it circulating as a lived reference point rather than a museum piece. The scientific community's engagement with the Chupacabra has been limited but occasionally productive. The repeated DNA analyses of purported Chupacabra carcasses have contributed to databases of genetic variation in coyote and dog populations, even though that was not their primary purpose. Veterinary studies of mange and other diseases affecting wild canids have gained visibility through their connection to the Chupacabra phenomenon. The attention drawn to diseased wildlife has, in some cases, led to increased awareness of ecosystem health and environmental stressors affecting wild populations. If the Chupacabra legend has had the inadvertent effect of making people pay more attention to the condition of local wildlife, that might be counted as a benefit, even if the creature itself remains scientifically unverified. Science does not exist in a vacuum. It responds to public interest and concern. The Chupacabra has generated public interest in questions of biodiversity, disease ecology, and predator-prey relationships. Even if that interest is filtered through legend and speculation, skeptical organizations, like the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, have investigated Chupacabra claims repeatedly, inevitably concluding that the phenomenon is explained by mundane causes. Their investigations are methodologically sound, applying careful analysis to physical evidence and examining witness testimony for inconsistencies or likely sources of error. But skeptical debunking, however rigorous, rarely ends belief in a legend. Those who believe in the Chupacabra often view skeptical investigations with suspicion, seeing them as predetermined to reach negative conclusions regardless of the evidence. This is not entirely unfair. Skeptical investigations do begin with the assumption that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that in the absence of such evidence, mundane explanations should be preferred. This methodological skepticism is scientifically sound, but it can create a self-fulfilling prophecy where no evidence is ever quite sufficient to overcome the initial presumption of impossibility. For a creature like the Chupacabra to be accepted by mainstream science, it would require a type specimen, a physical body that could be examined, measured, and confirmed by multiple independent researchers. Photographs and videos, however compelling, are not sufficient. Eyewitness testimony, however consistent, is not sufficient. Until a Chupacabra body is produced that cannot be identified as a known animal, science will continue to classify it as unverified. But what if the extraordinary evidence appears and is misidentified? This is the nightmare scenario for cryptozoologists, that a genuine unknown creature could be dismissed as a diseased specimen of a known species, due to the predisposition of researchers to find mundane explanations. Could the Texas Chupacabras have included genuine unknown canids that were simply grouped with diseased coyotes, because researchers expected all the specimens to be coyotes? The DNA analysis would presumably distinguish a separate species, but genetic analysis has limitations. If the unknown creature were closely related to coyotes, the genetic difference might be subtle enough to be interpreted as natural variation rather than species distinction. This scenario requires a conspiracy of errors rather than a conspiracy of people. Multiple independent researchers all making the same mistake, but it remains technically possible. More likely, if there were a genuine unknown canid in the American Southwest, at least one specimen would have shown genetic markers distinct enough to trigger further investigation. The fact that this has not occurred suggests that the Texas Chupacabras are indeed what they appear to be, diseased coyotes. The Puerto Rican Chupacabra remains more mysterious by virtue of remaining uncaptured and largely undocumented except through eyewitness testimony. Without physical specimens to analyze, the legend retains flexibility. It can be anything. The descriptions provided by witnesses like Madeline Tolentino could represent a known animal seen under poor conditions and misinterpreted. They could represent a real but prosaic creature that has been mythologized in memory and retelling. They could represent a psychological phenomenon, a shared hallucination, or culturally shaped misperception. Or they could represent something genuinely unknown. The absence of physical evidence makes all these interpretations equally possible, at least in terms of pure logic. Occam's razor suggests we should prefer explanations that require fewer unsupported assumptions, which would favor mundane explanations over unknown creatures. But Occam's razor is a heuristic, not a law of nature. The simplest explanation is not always the correct one. We must also consider the possibility that the Chupacabra is not a single phenomenon, but multiple unrelated events that have been grouped together under one name due to superficial similarities. The bipedal reptilian creature of Puerto Rico, the hairless canid of Texas, and various sightings in other locations may have nothing to do with one another, except that they all involve livestock deaths and have all been labeled Chupacabra by media and witnesses. If this is the case, then investigating the Chupacabra is incoherent because there is no single thing to investigate. Each incident would need to be examined individually, on its own merits, without reference to other incidents that happen to share a label. This fragmentation of the phenomenon makes it resistant to systematic investigation. Any researcher attempting to study the Chupacabra would be studying a category error, trying to find patterns in events that are not actually related. This may be why the phenomenon has resisted scientific resolution. There may be nothing there to resolve, just a collection of unrelated mysteries grouped under a catchy name. The psychological dimension of the Chupacabra phenomenon deserves careful attention. Human perception is unreliable under stress, in poor lighting, and when expectations have been primed. A farmer who has heard about the Chupacabra, who has lost animals to unknown predators, who goes out at night with a flashlight, expecting to encounter something strange. Such a person is psychologically prepared to interpret ambiguous stimuli as confirming the legend. A glimpse of any unusual animal, a shadow that moves unexpectedly, even sounds in the darkness without any visual confirmation. All of these can be transformed into a Chupacabra sighting through the alchemy of expectation, fear, and cultural narrative. This is not to say that witnesses are lying, or even that they are mistaken in any simple sense. They are reporting their experience honestly. But experience itself is constructed, assembled from sensory input, and filtered through expectation, memory, and cultural framework. We see what we are prepared to see. What our culture has taught us is possible. False memory research demonstrates that memories can be altered by subsequent information and by the process of recounting them. Each time a witness tells their story, the memory is reconstructed, and details can be added, removed, or transformed without any conscious intention to deceive. A witness who sees something strange, and then hears a detailed description of the Chupacabra, may unconsciously incorporate elements of that description into their own memory, genuinely believing they saw those details when they may not have. This memory contamination is a serious problem for investigating any phenomenon that relies heavily on eyewitness testimony. By the time researchers interview a witness, the witness's memory may have been shaped by media coverage, conversations with neighbors, and previous retellings of their experience. Extracting what they actually perceived from what they have since added is extremely difficult, perhaps impossible. Collective delusion and mass hysteria are also possible explanations for at least some aspects of the Chupacabra phenomenon. When a community becomes convinced that a threat exists, individual members may interpret ordinary events through that lens, creating a feedback loop where every ambiguous occurrence is taken as confirmation of the threat. Social pressure to conform to community beliefs can lead people to report sightings they are uncertain about, or to reinterpret normal experiences as abnormal. This is not deception. People genuinely come to believe what their community believes. If everyone around us says that the Chupacabra is real and dangerous, it becomes psychologically difficult to maintain skepticism, particularly if we have had any experience that could be interpreted as relevant. The cattle mutilation panics of the 1970s in the American West provide a precedent. Thousands of cattle found dead with unusual wounds, interpreted by many as evidence of satanic cults, government conspiracies, or alien activity, but ultimately explained as normal predation and decomposition reinterpreted through the lens of fear and folklore. Yet dismissing the Chupacabra as purely psychological or sociological phenomenon risks a different kind of error: the dismissal of local. The farmers and ranchers who have lost animals know their land, know their animals, and know the local predators. When they say something unusual is happening, there may be a genuine anomaly, even if that anomaly is not the Chupacabra as popularly imagined. Environmental changes, new diseases, shifting predator behaviors, contamination. There are many ways that something genuinely unusual could be occurring, without requiring an unknown creature. Respecting local knowledge means taking seriously the claim that something is wrong, even while remaining skeptical about the specific interpretation of what that wrongness represents. The dead animals are not imaginary. The fear and economic loss are not imaginary. Whatever is causing them deserves investigation. Or something more prosaic but still significant. For small farmers in Puerto Rico, Latin America, and the American Southwest, the loss of even a few animals can be devastating. Chickens, goats, and small livestock represent both immediate food security and potential income. When these animals are killed by predators, the loss is material and immediate. The fear generated by the Chupacabra legend may have led to additional economic effects. Reluctance to keep livestock, expenditure on security measures, reduced property values in areas with heavy media coverage of attacks. Tourism based on the legend has created some economic benefit, with Chupacabra-themed attractions, tours, and merchandise generating revenue. But this benefit accrues primarily to larger commercial enterprises, rather than to the individuals and communities most affected by the phenomenon. The tourist who buys a Chupacabra t-shirt in San Juan contributes nothing to the farmer in rural Puerto Rico who has lost goats. The political dimension of the Chupacabra is subtle but significant. The creature has been used as a metaphor in political discourse, particularly in contexts where exploitation and resource extraction are concerns. In Mexico, references to the Chupacabra have appeared in protests against foreign corporations and neoliberal economic policies that are seen as extracting wealth without benefiting local communities. The image of a creature that drains life and leaves nothing behind is too apt a metaphor for certain economic relationships to be coincidental. Whether these metaphorical uses emerged organically from the legend or were deliberately constructed by activists is unclear and perhaps irrelevant. Metaphors work through resonance, not through conscious design. The Chupacabra resonates as an image of exploitation, precisely because the legend itself emerged from communities experiencing various forms of exploitation. In Puerto Rico specifically, the Chupacabra has sometimes been used to critique the American military presence on the island. Rumors that the creature was the result of genetic experiments at military facilities tapped into very real concerns about U.S. military activities in Puerto Rico, particularly the controversial bombing range on Vieques. The U.S. Navy used Vieques for bombing practice and military exercises from 1941 to 2003, generating persistent concerns about environmental contamination, health effects on the civilian population, and the appropriateness of using inhabited territory for weapons testing. The Chupacabra as military experiment gave narrative form to these concerns, transforming abstract anxieties about invisible contamination into a concrete, visible threat. That this narrative was almost certainly false does not diminish its psychological and political truth. The Chupacabra became a way of talking about American power in Puerto Rico, a symbol of forces beyond local control that nonetheless affect local life directly and harmfully. The persistence of the Chupacabra legend into the 21st century, despite repeated debunking and scientific explanation, suggests that the legend serves functions that cannot be displaced by facts. Folklore is not eliminated by being disproven, because folklore is not primarily about facts. It is about meaning, about giving narrative shape to experience, about creating shared cultural references that bind communities together. The Chupacabra is real in the sense that it is a real cultural object with real effects on how people understand their world. Whether it corresponds to a biological entity is from an anthropological perspective secondary. The legend exists, is transmitted, is adapted to new contexts, and continues to evolve. This makes it a successful legend, regardless of whether there is an actual creature corresponding to the description. We might consider the Chupacabra in relation to other modern legends that have achieved similar cultural penetration. The urban legend of the vanishing hitchhiker, the belief in satanic ritual abuse that swept the United States in the 1980s, the various conspiracy theories about government cover-ups. All of these persist, despite lack of evidence and active debunking, because they satisfy psychological and social needs. They explain the inexplicable, provide targets for diffuse anxieties, create in group and out, group boundaries based on belief, and offer narrative structures through which to understand complex realities. The Chupacabra functions similarly. It explains livestock deaths that might have mundane causes, but feel wrong, feel like they need a better explanation than coyotes or disease. It gives form to anxieties about environmental change, economic precarity, and political powerlessness. It creates community among believers through shared experience of the phenomenon. These functions cannot be replaced by scientific explanation, because scientific explanation does not address the psychological and social needs that generate the legend in the first place. The Chupacabra also represents a form of resistance to authority, though this resistance is more passive than active. When officials say that the creature does not exist, that the attacks are mundane predation, that there is nothing to worry about, and people continue to believe in and report the Chupacabra anyway, they are asserting the value of their own experience against official expertise. This is not inherently irrational. Official authorities have frequently been wrong, have frequently dismissed local concerns that turned out to be valid, have frequently prioritized bureaucratic convenience over genuine investigation. Why should a farmer trust a government veterinarian who spends an hour examining a carcass over their own decades of experience raising animals? The persistence of the legend in the face of official denial is not merely stubbornness or ignorance. It is an assertion of the validity of local knowledge and direct experience. It is a claim that the people on the ground, the people directly affected, have insight that distant experts may lack. This tension between local knowledge and expert knowledge is fundamental to understanding not just the Chupacabra, but many contemporary conflicts over truth and authority. In an era when trust in institutions is declining, when expertise is increasingly viewed with suspicion, legends like the Chupacabra thrive in the gap between what authorities say is true and what people experience as true. This gap is dangerous because it allows false beliefs to persist and can lead to poor decisions based on those beliefs. But the gap exists because authorities have not always been trustworthy, because expertise has sometimes been used to dismiss legitimate concerns, because the scientific method, for all its power, cannot address every question people care about. The Chupacabra will not be eliminated by better science communication or more thorough debunking. It will persist as long as the underlying conditions that generate it persist. Communities experiencing predation they cannot fully explain or control. Cultural narratives that prepare people to see the world in particular ways, and a relationship with institutional authority that is characterized by distrust and skepticism. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the Chupacabra continues to evolve. Social media has become its primary habitat, with sightings reported instantly and spreading globally before they can be investigated or verified. The ease of creating and distributing fake images and videos means that the evidentiary landscape is more polluted than ever. For every genuine photograph of a diseased coyote, there are a dozen obvious hoaxes, making it difficult for even sincere researchers to separate signal from noise. The democratization of media production means that anyone can create Chupacabra content, whether as art, entertainment, hoax, or sincere documentation. This proliferation of content keeps the legend visible and active, but also dilutes it, making it difficult to maintain coherent understanding of what the Chupacabra is supposed to be. The creature risks becoming whatever anyone wants it to be, losing the specific cultural roots that gave it power. Climate change may generate new waves of Chupacabra sightings in the coming decades. As ecosystems shift, as droughts become more severe, as wildlife populations are stressed by changing conditions, we may see more diseased animals, more unusual predator behaviors, more encounters between humans and wildlife, forced into proximity by habitat loss. Each of these could be interpreted through the Chupacabra framework, giving the legend renewed relevance. The creature may evolve into a symbol of ecological disruption, a manifestation of the damage humans have inflicted on natural systems. This would represent a shift from the legend's original associations with supernatural threat or government conspiracy toward an environmental interpretation. But this shift would be consistent with how folklore has always worked, adapting to new circumstances while retaining core elements that give it continuity with the past. The question of whether the Chupacabra is real may ultimately be the wrong question. The creature is real as a cultural phenomenon, Real as a narrative that shapes how certain communities understand livestock predation. Real as a symbol that carries multiple layers of meaning. Whether it corresponds to an actual biological organism is almost beside the point. The legend does real work in the world, creating community bonds, expressing anxieties, resisting authority, and providing entertainment. These effects would not disappear if someone definitively proved that no unknown creature exists. The Chupacabra would simply migrate entirely into the realm of acknowledged fiction, like dragons or vampires. Creatures we know are not real but that retain cultural power nonetheless. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of the Chupacabra phenomenon is what it reveals about the human need for mystery. In an age when satellite imagery maps every square inch of the planet, when smartphones put vast databases of information in everyone's pocket, when science seems capable of explaining almost everything, there is something psychologically necessary about preserving spaces of uncertainty. The Chupacabra represents the unknown that persists despite our tools and knowledge. It suggests that the world is not yet fully mapped, not yet fully explained, that there remain dark corners where strange things dwell. This may be comforting rather than frightening, a bulwark against the existential anxiety of living in a fully known world. If the Chupacabra can exist, if the world is more interesting, more alive with possibility, the Chupacabra legend also forces us to confront the limits of certainty. No amount of negative evidence can conclusively prove that something does not exist, only that it has not been found. The absence of confirmed Chupacabra specimens proves that no one has captured one, but it does not prove that none exist. This logical asymmetry, it is easier to prove existence than non-existence, gives legends enormous resilience. There is always the possibility, however remote, that the next sighting will be the one that finally provides definitive proof. This possibility, mathematical more than realistic, keeps the legend alive for believers. And for skeptics, the continued belief, despite lack of evidence, becomes itself a phenomenon worth studying, a window into human psychology and culture that is valuable regardless of whether the creature exists. We live in a time of profound uncertainty about the future. Climate change, political instability, technological disruption, economic inequality, the forces shaping contemporary life, often feel beyond individual understanding or control. In this context, the Chupacabra represents something more manageable, a threat that is local, specific, and concrete. You can protect your animals from the Chupacabra by penning them securely, by staying vigilant, by taking precautions. This is far easier than protecting yourself from global forces that operate at scales too large to comprehend. The legend may persist because it transforms diffuse, abstract anxiety into focused, concrete fear. Fear of a specific creature is easier to manage than fear of societal collapse or environmental catastrophe. By displacing larger fears onto a monster, the Chupacabra makes the world psychologically navigable, even as it becomes more complex and threatening. The creature also serves as a reminder that not everything has been domesticated, that wilderness and danger persist despite urbanization and technological advancement. For people living in rural areas, particularly those engaged in agriculture and ranching, this is not metaphor but lived reality. Predators are real, livestock losses are real. The night is genuinely dangerous in ways that urban and suburban dwellers rarely experience. The Chupacabra amplifies this reality, makes it mythic. It emerges from genuine vulnerability, genuine dependence on animals that are themselves vulnerable, genuine knowledge that threats exist in the darkness beyond the porch light. That this real vulnerability might sometimes be interpreted through legend, rather than biology, does not make it any less real. The enduring appeal of the Chupacabra may also reflect a nostalgia for a time when the world contained genuine mysteries, when blank spaces on the map could conceal unknown creatures. The age of exploration is over. The age of discovering large unknown animals is effectively over, at least on land. The major ecosystems have been catalogued, the major species described and classified. New species are still discovered, but they tend to be small: insects, amphibians, fish. The possibility of a large, conspicuous, unknown animal in well-populated areas is vanishingly small. The Chupacabra resists this foreclosure of possibility. It insists that unknown creatures might still exist, that the catalogue is not complete, that wonders remain. This insistence is almost certainly wrong in literal terms, but it is psychologically powerful. It suggests that we have not yet exhausted the world, not yet reduced it entirely to the known and the controlled. In considering the Chupacabra as a modern myth born from fear and imagination, we must recognize that fear and imagination are not dismissive terms. Fear is a rational response to genuine threats. Imagination is the capacity that allows humans to understand their world, to generate explanations for what they observe, to create meaning from experience. The Chupacabra, whether or not it exists as a biological entity, exists as a product of human meaning making. It is how certain communities have chosen to understand and articulate their experience of predation, vulnerability, and the presence of forces beyond their control. This understanding may not be scientifically accurate, but it is culturally coherent and psychologically meaningful. The legend has traveled from a small Puerto Rican town to the global stage, from local folklore to international phenomenon. In that journey, it has been transformed repeatedly, adapted to new contexts, interpreted through new lenses. The bipedal reptilian creature of the initial reports has been joined by the diseased coyotes of Texas, by various local adaptations throughout Latin America, by fictional versions in media and popular culture. The Chupacabra is now many things, a family of related legends rather than a single coherent phenomenon. Yet certain elements persist: the focus on livestock, the blood drainage, the nocturnal activity, the elusiveness. These core features give the legend continuity even as it evolves and diversifies. As climate and environmental pressures increase, as rural communities face mounting economic challenges, as the gap between official narratives and lived experience widens, the Chupacabra may gain rather than lose relevance. The conditions that generated the legend have not disappeared. In many ways, they have intensified. Droughts in the American Southwest are more severe and prolonged than historical patterns. Wildlife populations are stressed by habitat loss and climate change. Rural communities throughout North America face economic uncertainty as traditional livelihoods become less viable. These pressures create the conditions for legend to flourish, for unexplained livestock deaths to be interpreted through the lens of the extraordinary rather than the mundane. The Chupacabra may be less a relic of 1990s panic than a preview of how communities will narrate their experience of environmental and economic disruption in the coming decades. The creature has become a symbol of the global South's relationship with the global North, of indigenous and local knowledge's conflict with metropolitan expertise, of communities resisting narratives imposed from outside. That the Chupacabra emerged first in Puerto Rico, a Caribbean island with a complex colonial relationship to the United States, is significant. That it spread most vigorously through Latin America, a region defined by histories of colonialism and ongoing economic exploitation, is significant. That it has been consistently dismissed and explained away by authorities based in wealthy, powerful institutions is significant. The Chupacabra is not just a creature in a folk legend. It is a site of conflict over who gets to define reality, whose knowledge counts as legitimate, whose experience is taken seriously. We are left with questions that cannot be fully answered. Is there a biological entity corresponding to the Chupacabra? Almost certainly not, at least not in the form described by the most dramatic eyewitness accounts. Are the livestock deaths that have been attributed to the Chupacabra entirely explained by known causes? Probably, though, the consistency of certain features, the blood drainage, the lack of consumption, remains somewhat puzzling. Is the Chupacabra purely a cultural construct, a legend with no basis in unusual physical phenomena? This seems unlikely. Something has been killing livestock in ways that alarmed experienced farmers and ranchers. And while that something may be mundane, it was unusual enough to trigger this extensive folkloric response. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in the uncomfortable middle ground between complete belief and complete dismissal. The Chupacabra persists because it meets needs that science cannot fully satisfy. It provides narrative structure to frightening experiences. It creates bonds among those who share belief or experience. It allows communities to assert their own knowledge against outside expertise. It transforms economic loss into something mythic, something that matters beyond the merely financial. It preserves mystery in a world that seems increasingly explained and controlled. These are not trivial functions. They are essential to how humans make meaning and maintain community. A world without legends, without myths, without stories that transcend literal fact, would be a diminished world. The Chupacabra, real or not, contributes to the richness of human culture, the diversity of how different communities understand their relationship with the natural world and with forces beyond their control. In a Texas ranch yard, a strange shape crosses the space between barn and fence. In a Mexican village, a farmer discovers animals dead in ways that defy his understanding. These events are real, are documented, are experienced by people whose lives are shaped by them. Whether the explanation is disease, known predators, environmental disruption, or something yet unidentified, the fear is genuine. The loss is genuine. The need to make sense of it is genuine. The Chupacabra is the name we give to that need. The story we tell to it is the blood-sucking beast of Puerto Rico and beyond. A creature of the boundary between the known and the unknown, between science and legend, between explanation and mystery. The question, is it real, may matter less than we think. The Chupacabra is real enough to have entered the cultural consciousness of millions, to have generated decades of sightings and investigation, to have inspired art and commerce and debate. It is real enough to have provided communities with a shared narrative through which to understand threatening experiences. It is real enough to have revealed fissures between local and expert knowledge, between lived experience and scientific explanation. These realities persist regardless of whether a creature matching the description has ever walked the earth. The legend is the reality, and the legend will endure as long as the conditions that generated it endure. We stand now in the long shadow cast by that first livestock found dead in Canfevanas. In 1995, drained and mysterious. In the years since, thousands of animals have been found dead under similar circumstances. Thousands of people have reported sightings of strange creatures. Dozens of bodies have been examined and identified as known animals. Countless hours of investigation have been conducted by believers and skeptics alike. The evidence has accumulated, and yet the mystery persists. Perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps some questions are more valuable for the asking than the answering. Perhaps the Chupacabra's greatest gift is not the creature itself, but the space of uncertainty it creates. The reminder that even in our scientifically sophisticated age, there are still shadows where explanation falters and wonder begins. In those shadows, something waits. Whether it is a diseased coyote, an unknown species, or simply the projection of human fear onto the darkness hardly matters. What matters is that we continue to look, continue to wonder, continue to tell stories about what might be lurking just beyond the light. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more folklore, myths, and mysterious creatures. See you next time.
欢迎使用闪电音频剪辑软件